On that tense evening, Maxwell's eyes dart between his mother's stern face and the untouched plate of food in front of him. His heart thumps so hard he can almost feel the vibration in his throat. Mrs. Rebecca, sitting at the head of the table, stares with disapproval etched across her features. She tells him in a firm voice that he must never be seen around Sandra again. Those words strike Maxwell like a wave of icy water. He grips the edge of his seat, struggling to keep his emotions in check. He shoots a glance at his father, Mr. Alexander, who watches quietly with one hand pressed against his chin. The silence that follows is painfully long. Maxwell realizes he's at a crossroads, certain that if he doesn't speak, he might never be able to live with himself. He clears his throat, trying to sound calm. "Mom, I can't hide it anymore," he says. "I love her." The moment those words leave his lips, the air feels heavier than before. The household staff members, lined up near the walls, exchange surprised looks. Sandra isn't in the dining room now, but Maxwell can only imagine how she would feel if she heard this conversation. Mrs. Rebecca's voice sharpens. She utters one simple question, "Love?" Her tone suggests disbelief, as though it's the strangest thing she has ever heard. She sets down her fork and pushes her chair back. She repeats with even more force, "Love." Maxwell's ears are pounding, and he feels an odd mixture of terror and resolve. His father remains silent, letting his wife take the lead. Maxwell knows his mother sees Sandra as just the personal maid. To her, Sandra isn't worthy of sharing a meal at their table, let alone building a life with Maxwell, the only son in this wealthy family. The silence crawls across the room again. A clock on the wall ticks in a slow, steady rhythm, measuring each agonizing second. Maxwell's mind races, thinking of what to say next. But his mother breaks the silence first, rising from her seat. She meets Maxwell's eyes with a disappointed stare. "You will not see Sandra again," she declares, pointing a finger for emphasis. "I don't want to hear any more about this." Her words hang in the air, and she exits, leaving Maxwell and his father alone at the table. Mr. Alexander gently pushes his plate away, not looking entirely surprised. Maxwell notices his father's thoughtful expression. He waits, hoping his father will offer support or at least a hint of understanding. But Mr. Alexander simply sighs, rising to follow his wife without a word. It feels like a sudden betrayal to Maxwell, who has always looked to his father for guidance. Maxwell stays in his seat, trying to steady his breathing. The glow from the chandelier above makes the polished surface of the long dining table shine, but it also casts shadows that seem to mirror his doubts. He thinks back to how this all began. The day he returned from the United States, the house was filled with warmth and celebration. Mr. Alexander and Mrs. Rebecca had big smiles when they saw him step out of the car at the gates. It had been 5 years since they had last hugged him in person. He remembers how Mrs. Rebecca's eyes lit up with pride, telling everyone how her son had just finished studying computer engineering at Harvard. The staff had lined up to welcome him, clapping as he entered the mansion. Sandra was there too, but at that time she was standing quietly behind the other maids. He didn't notice her much that first day. He was swept up in the joy of returning. The large front hall had fresh flowers on every table, and the floors were so shiny he could see his reflection as he walked. He felt the love of his parents in every detail of the homecoming party. The next few days passed with visits from old friends, business associates, and extended relatives. They all wanted to congratulate Maxwell on his degree. He felt the weight of everyone's expectations pushing down on him. They hoped he would help his father manage the family's tech company, turning it into an even greater empire. Maxwell was excited, though he also felt a little overwhelmed. Late at night, as he paced the quiet hallways, he kept reminding himself that his father's trust was not something to be taken lightly. A week after his arrival, he noticed Sandra more closely. She was carrying a tray of fresh flowers to his mother's bedroom. She moved with a quiet grace that caught his eye. He remembered thinking that she looked calm and purposeful in her every step. At first, he shook off any interest, telling himself she was just another member of the staff. But his curiosity grew when he found her organizing books in the study late one evening. He had come in to look for a file, and there she was, placing hardcover novels in alphabetical order with neat precision. He teased her gently, saying that no one else in the house seemed to be that organized. She laughed softly and mumbled something about wanting to keep everything neat for Mrs. Rebecca. Her laugh was what really struck him. It felt warm and genuine, unlike the formal tone most of the staff used. In the days that followed, Maxwell began seeing Sandra more often. Sometimes he would pass by the kitchen and see her quietly preparing tea. Other times he saw her dusting the living room or polishing the furniture in the hallway. Each time, she flashed him a polite smile and a slight nod. Something about her presence felt comforting, like a small break from the high-stress environment in which he lived. He wasn't sure when he started to feel drawn to her. Maybe it was the day he found her in the garden, admiring the flowers. She looked serene, reaching out to touch the petals of a hibiscus plant. She seemed to appreciate simple things in a world that often felt too large and too complicated. One afternoon, Maxwell gathered the courage to approach her in the garden. He walked across the manicured lawn, trying to act casual, but his heart was hammering. She turned to him, startled at first, but she relaxed as soon as she recognized him. They chatted about how peaceful the garden felt compared to the busy routine inside the house. She mentioned she often came out here to clear her mind after finishing her duties. He found himself opening up about his recent return from the States and how different life felt here. She listened attentively, nodding at the right moments. Maxwell realized he felt comfortable talking to her, in a way he didn't often feel with people who only saw him as the billionaire's son. After that, he found more excuses to spend time with her. They walked around the garden, talked about their backgrounds, and laughed about the staff's quirks. She admitted she had been hired during his last year of college. She said she had worked at a small hotel before Mrs. Rebecca brought her into the household. Maxwell could tell she spoke kindly of his mother because Mrs. Rebecca had given her a chance when she was struggling to find steady work. Although Maxwell appreciated his mother's generosity, he began to sense a subtle friction. He didn't think his mother would be thrilled to see him growing close to a maid. Still, he pushed those worries aside, believing that if the bond was real, no one's opinion would break it. The turning point came on a quiet evening when they were both alone in the garden. The sun was sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in pink and orange. They sat on a bench under a broad tree. Maxwell noticed Sandra's eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight. He felt a sudden rush of affection, and he couldn't keep it inside anymore. He told her how much he enjoyed talking to her, how her smile brightened his day, and how he felt drawn to her kindness. She looked at him with surprise. Her face flushed, and for a moment, she was speechless. Then, just as he was about to ask if she felt the same, she got up from the bench and hurried away without a word. Maxwell sat there, stunned, watching her disappear around the corner. His heart sank with confusion. He worried that he had scared her off, that maybe he had read her warmth incorrectly. The next morning, he spotted her in the hallway while he was on his way out to work. She greeted him quietly, looking nervous, and he couldn't help asking why she had run off the night before. She apologized, her voice trembling, and explained that she was afraid of what his parents might think. "They've been kind to me," she whispered, keeping her eyes on the polished floor. "I don't want to lose my job." Maxwell tried to reassure her, telling her that his life was his own to manage, but she just shook her head with a sad smile. "I'm sorry," she said, and hurried past him. At dinner that evening, Mrs. Rebecca announced in a pointed tone that she had noticed Maxwell spending a lot of time with Sandra. She didn't mince words. She said a personal maid shouldn't have that kind of closeness with her son. Maxwell felt his temper rise, but he tried to speak calmly. He told her that he had real feelings for Sandra, that he appreciated how genuine she was. His mother responded with shock, labeling it a passing fantasy. She insisted he stop spending time with her. The tension escalated until Maxwell stormed out. His father simply observed, not stepping in to defend or chastise either side. As the days passed, Maxwell began bringing small gifts for Sandra whenever he came home from the office. He would choose thoughtful items, like a simple necklace, a pretty scarf, or a small box of chocolates. At first, she refused, worried that Mrs. Rebecca might notice and judge her for it. Maxwell refused to take no for an answer, gently explaining that he wanted her to have nice things. She eventually accepted with tears in her eyes, whispering thank you. She would hurry to her room, leaving Maxwell standing in the hallway, hoping that one day, she wouldn't need to hide her happiness. Soon, Sandra started wearing some of the clothes Maxwell bought for her, though only in discreet moments when she thought Mrs. Rebecca wouldn't see. She would slip on a new blouse in the garden, away from prying eyes. Maxwell felt a thrill watching her in clothes that he had selected, noticing her confidence bloom. He also saw the faint fear that lingered in her eyes. Whenever Mrs. Rebecca walked into the room, Sandra would tense up, adjusting her posture like she was waiting for a scolding. Maxwell's heart went out to her. He wished there were a simpler way for them to be together. Meanwhile, the rest of the staff seemed to notice this budding relationship. Some whispered excitedly in the corners of the kitchen, believing Sandra's fate was changing for the better. A few were jealous, but most seemed happy for her, as she had always been respectful and hardworking. Maxwell often overheard them talking about the warm glow in Sandra's eyes whenever he was around. He could barely contain his own smile when he caught such remarks. One night, as Maxwell and Sandra sat under the dim light of the garden lamps, they shared stories about their childhoods. He told her about growing up in luxury, how his parents had always tried to shield him from difficulties. She told him about her struggles, how she had lost her father at a young age, and had to work to support her mother and younger brother in a distant town. Maxwell felt a surge of admiration for her resilience. In that moment, he realized that his feelings went beyond a simple crush. He saw a future where their worlds could merge, where he could help lighten her burdens. She gently touched his arm, thanking him for his kindness, but she remained uncertain about their future. Her doubts were rooted in the obvious gap between them. She was the maid and he was the heir to a fortune. Their bond grew stronger each day. They found small ways to spend time together, lingering in the hallway after Maxwell returned from work, stealing a few minutes in the kitchen before the chef arrived to start dinner, or meeting in the garden as the sun sank behind the tall walls surrounding the mansion. Mrs. Rebecca noticed that despite her warnings, Maxwell refused to distance himself from Sandra. She grew concerned, worried that this relationship could stain the family's reputation. She decided to speak with her husband in private. She tried to convince Mr. Alexander to demand that Maxwell end the relationship. But Mr. Alexander surprised her by saying that their son was an adult who deserved to choose his own path. He reminded her how they had always taught Maxwell to be independent and to think for himself. His words lingered in Mrs. Rebecca's mind. She loved Maxwell deeply, and a part of her realized that he was old enough to decide his own happiness. However, it still bothered her that Sandra was of a lower social class. She felt torn between wanting to protect her son and letting him follow his heart. As the days turned into weeks, she grew tired of the tension in the house. She saw the way Maxwell lit up around Sandra, and she began to doubt her earlier stance. One night at dinner, she quietly told one of the other maids to invite Sandra to join them at the table. The entire household froze in shock at that request, and Maxwell, who was about to take a sip of water, almost dropped his glass. He looked toward the dining room door, where Sandra stood hesitantly, eyes wide with confusion. Mrs. Rebecca gestured to an empty chair, telling Sandra to sit. Nervously, Sandra obeyed, avoiding eye contact with Maxwell. He waited in silence, not sure if this was some kind of test or a trick. Then Mr. Alexander cleared his throat. "I've decided to support my son," he said in a steady voice. "He has told us he cares deeply for you, Sandra. I see no reason to stand in his way." Sandra's cheeks turned hot, and she trembled slightly. Before she could respond, Mrs. Rebecca added in a softer tone than Maxwell had heard in weeks. "My dear, I've seen your loyalty in this house. You've worked hard. You've respected everyone, including me. If Maxwell says he loves you, I trust that he understands what love means. I only ask that you both remember where you come from and remain humble." Maxwell felt a rush of relief so intense that his eyes pricked with tears. He looked from his mother to his father, not quite believing that they had given their blessing. Sandra swallowed hard, struggling to find her voice. She finally managed a shaky, "Thank you," her eyes glistening with gratitude. Maxwell reached over and squeezed her hand under the table, as if to assure her that this wasn't a dream. The maids standing along the wall exchanged smiles, and some lowered their heads, perhaps to hide the emotions that were brimming. From that moment on, Maxwell and Sandra no longer had to sneak around or speak in hushed tones. They strolled around the mansion's halls openly. They watched television together in the lounge, discussing movies and shows like any normal couple. Mrs. Rebecca softened day by day, especially when she saw how happy Maxwell appeared. Mr. Alexander, true to his calm nature, offered them whatever support they needed. He even joked that since Maxwell's job was to assist him at the tech company, maybe Sandra could help keep Maxwell organized there, too. Life settled into a pleasant routine. Maxwell would go to work in the morning, greet Sandra if she was tidying up the living room or assisting Mrs. Rebecca with breakfast. After work, he would bring her new clothes or simple tokens of affection. She would meet him in the garden, wearing one of those gifts, her eyes shining with gratitude. They would chat about the new software solutions he was developing at the company, or about her plans to visit her family to share the good news. Sometimes they discussed the tension that had existed only a short while ago, marveling at how quickly everything changed once Mr. Alexander gave his approval. A month later, Maxwell decided to make things official. He asked Sandra if she would consider a future with him. She blushed and nodded, admitting that she had always been scared of dreaming this big. Maxwell laughed gently, telling her that dreams were meant to be big, or else they weren't worth pursuing. Soon, the house was buzzing with wedding preparations. Mrs. Rebecca, who had once been so opposed to the idea, took charge of ordering decorations and planning a small celebration. She insisted that the ceremony remain private, given that Sandra and Maxwell wanted something simple. Mr. Alexander stood back with a pleased grin, stepping in only when asked for his input. On the morning of the wedding, Sandra felt a swirl of emotions she had never experienced. She dressed in an elegant gown that Maxwell had picked out. Her hands trembled as one of the maids helped arrange her hair. She gazed into the mirror, finding it hard to recognize the reflection staring back. She was the same person who had once worried about living paycheck to paycheck, yet now she was about to marry the son of a billionaire. The thought made her throat tight, and tears of happiness welled up in her eyes. Meanwhile, Maxwell stood in the mansion's foyer, adjusting his tie with unsteady hands. He was used to giving presentations to high-profile investors, but this was the first time he felt truly nervous. He kept glancing at the wide staircase, waiting for Sandra to appear. When Sandra finally descended the stairs, the entire household fell into awed silence. Mrs. Rebecca and Mr. Alexander were there, wearing proud expressions. The father and mother exchanged a meaningful look, as if to acknowledge how far they had come from that night at the dinner table. Maxwell could barely breathe as Sandra reached the bottom step. He extended his arm, and she accepted it, smiling so brightly that it warmed everyone around them. A few moments later, they exchanged vows in a simple ceremony right there in the mansion's main hall. The staff stood by like family, cheering softly at the end. It was small and intimate, but it felt more genuine to them than any lavish affair. They shared their first dance in that same hall, with soft music playing in the background. Sandra laughed when Maxwell accidentally stepped on her toe, and he blushed, apologizing. She told him it was the most wonderful moment of her life. He told her he would make sure every moment to come was just as wonderful. The staff brought out a modest wedding cake, topped with simple decorations. Mr. Alexander clapped loudly, calling for a round of applause, and Mrs. Rebecca shed a few tears she tried to hide. The household staff seemed to glow with joy, congratulating Sandra with hugs and warm wishes for the future. Some teased that she would never have to polish another piece of furniture again. She responded with grateful laughter, saying she would still help out if needed, because she owed so much to this home. In the days that followed, Maxwell arranged a special shopping trip for Sandra. They went out together, strolling through a modern mall where people recognized him as the heir to Alexander's tech empire. He didn't seem to care about the stares. He guided Sandra into various stores, urging her to pick whatever she liked. She walked around timidly at first, unsure of what to choose. He gently nudged her toward a display of jewelry, and she admired a pair of earrings that sparkled under the bright lights. He bought them for her without hesitation. They moved on to clothing boutiques, where he insisted she try on dresses. She eventually gave in, smiling each time she saw her reflection in the dressing room mirror. At one point, she caught herself looking at Maxwell, and she had to blink back tears. She remembered all the times she had worn worn-out uniforms, cleaning floors and dusting shelves. Now here she was, standing side by side with the man who changed her life. They returned to the mansion with several shopping bags, and Sandra thanked Maxwell more times than he could count. He only laughed, telling her it was a joy to see her happy. She spent the rest of that evening going through her new belongings, carefully folding her new clothes and running her fingers over the pieces of jewelry. Maxwell sat nearby, watching her reaction with silent delight. He was well aware that material items weren't the foundation of their relationship, but he wanted to give her a taste of the life he had grown up in. He hoped that each gift would remind her of how deeply he cared. As time went on, the other staff members adjusted to the new reality. Sandra was no longer just a colleague to them. She was now part of the family. Some teased her playfully, saying she had won the biggest prize in the world. She would blush and respond that she still wanted to be seen as the same humble person she had always been. Mrs. Rebecca tested Sandra's loyalty and behavior a few times, asking her to handle small tasks around the house. Sandra, wanting to show her gratitude, always did them with the same diligence as before. This display of consistent humility melted any lingering doubts Mrs. Rebecca had. Soon, she began introducing Sandra to her friends with pride. Mr. Alexander also involved Sandra in more family activities. He'd invite her and Maxwell to dinner with important business associates. At first, Sandra was uneasy, worried that her background would make the guests look down on her. But Maxwell was always by her side, guiding her through conversations and social norms. Over time, she learned to hold her own, smiling and speaking up when required. The associates remarked on how gracious she was, praising her gentle manner. Each successful dinner boosted her confidence, and Maxwell's parents became more convinced that they had made the right choice in supporting this union. From time to time, Sandra would think back to her early days in the household, remembering when she would scramble to greet Mrs. Rebecca in the morning or hurriedly serve tea without making eye contact. She remembered the heartbreak she felt when Maxwell first told her he cared about her. She had been so sure that she would lose her job if anyone found out. Now, everything had changed in the most beautiful way. She woke up each morning feeling like she was living a dream she never dared to imagine. Maxwell noticed a change in his own perspective, too. He grew more responsible, arriving at the office early and tackling challenges with a newfound drive. He saw the future not just as a line of corporate successes, but as a personal journey he would share with someone he loved. He brought fresh ideas to board meetings, suggesting new product lines and philanthropic work that would help people from different walks of life. Mr. Alexander watched his son's growth with admiration, seeing how love had turned Maxwell into a man who thought beyond himself. A few months passed, and the family decided to throw a bigger reception at a local event center to celebrate the marriage more publicly. Invitations went out to close friends, extended relatives, and even some business partners. The night of the reception, Sandra appeared in a graceful dress that accentuated her figure in a tasteful way. Maxwell matched her outfit with a well-tailored suit. They walked into the event hall arm in arm, while soft music played. Guests rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Many were seeing Sandra for the first time as Maxwell's wife. There was a blend of surprise and happiness on their faces. Mrs. Rebecca served as a host, guiding Sandra around the room, introducing her to family members who had traveled from far. Sandra tried to keep all the names straight, greeting each person with respect. Mr. Alexander moved through the crowd as well, making sure everyone had enough to eat and drink. making jokes about how he was thrilled to have a daughter now. He even teased Maxwell, saying that his son's life was bound to be more colorful with Sandra around. Maxwell took it all in, smiling at how natural it felt. This was the life he wanted: unity, love, and a sense of shared purpose. Late into the night, a few guests raised toasts, praising the couple for defying conventions and following their hearts. After the reception, the couple returned home, exhausted but happy. They changed into comfortable clothes and sat on the balcony, gazing at the moonlit sky. Sandra leaned her head on Maxwell's shoulder, and he wrapped an arm around her. They talked softly about everything that had happened. Maxwell asked her if she ever regretted any moment that led to this. She shook her head, answering that even the painful moments of uncertainty had shaped their journey, reminding them not to take any blessing for granted. He kissed the top of her head, promising he would always remember the challenges they had overcome.